Welcome to Sustainable Packaging with Cory Connors. Today's guest is my friend Vicki Strull. She is a packaging designer, design strategist for her own business called Vicki Strull Design. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Cory.
Good. I've looked up to you for a long time and appreciate your very insightful posts on social media, and you have a great reputation for that. So thank you for taking some time to do this show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about you. Can you tell us about yourself and how you got into packaging design?
Sure. I'm a graphic designer by trade, but when I think about design, I really think about how design helps and connects to business goals. So I've morphed into design strategist.
Yeah.
I became a packaging designer. One, I think intuitively, I just think in 3D. I think when you're creative, there are people that think in 2 dimensions and people that think in 3 dimensions. I happen to think in 3D, so packaging came pretty easily to me, even early in my career. And then I put a focus on it about 10 years ago when I was doing some work for HP, and then I was executive creative director at WS Packaging before they got purchased, and then it just blossomed from there. And so I've been doing it for a while, and I do it for big companies and little companies. I mean, I just did a specialty food brand called Wildfare where we had, I don't know, 150 SKUs or something, and just
No big deal. 150. Wow. Geez, that's incredible. That's a huge scope of work. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. So I know we're going to be doing your podcast a little differently today. I don't know if you want to explain why.
Yeah. So Vicki's asked me to make this more of a back and forth interview, and we will highlight this in a magazine. I'll let you tell everyone about that. So be prepared for Vicki to interview me during this podcast as well, which is a first. I'm so excited for this idea. Thank you again, Vicki, for bringing it to us. What's the magazine called that this will be focused on in?
So this will be in an issue of Labels and Labeling. It's a publication that's global, and it's actually print and it's online. So we'll coordinate the posting of this podcast to that. So if anyone wants to read the interpretation of some of this, although it's going to be an interview, and listen, it'll correlate back and forth. But with that, I'm really excited also to talk to you, because I think what you're doing in the industry with this podcast is just amazing, helping people learn about sustainable packaging and the future of sustainable packaging. So how did you decide to start this podcast?
Yeah, great question. Long story, but I'll try to make it brief for this. My friends Adam Peak and Avelio Matos really encouraged me to start the podcast. They said, we each have one, you need one. Come on, man, let's do it. And it should be about sustainability, because that's what you always talk about. And I said, I don't know, that sounds like a massive undertaking. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And with the help of some great people, my wife and Kyle Kaplanis, who's a social media expert, they talked me through the process, and very steep learning curves. This is not an easy process to start or to keep going, but that was really the impetus, and started way back a few years ago making TikToks, and then it just has morphed over the years to this podcast, which has taken off, and really excited to be a part of this community that is very much focused on making this world a better place.
What kind of impact are you seeing? I mean, after more than 170 episodes, can you start to feel the impact that you're having?
Yes, I'm getting reached out to by large corporations and government agencies. The USDA just recently reached out and said, hey, I heard your podcast. Would you come and talk with your marketing vice president, Chris Bradley, and speak to the UN about packaging? And we said, what? Okay. And just a real honor and a true opportunity in this world to be able to say, hey kids, your dad's going to Brussels to speak to the government. And like, wow, I never thought it would go this far, but I'm thrilled for these opportunities.
It's pretty amazing and quite an honor.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you a question, and I know we're going to go back and forth in this.
I love it.
In every episode, you ask, can packaging be sustainable? So can it be sustainable after, everything that you've learned?
Yeah.
Can it be sustainable?
Yeah, I actually stopped asking that question because everyone basically said the same thing. Yes, it can. We can do it. We can make this happen. And I only had actually one person who said no. And she was very much a brilliant friend and a great person. But she said, no, we can't do it. It's not possible. There's too many variables. There's too many people that are naysayers. There's too many obstacles. And she just thought it wasn't possible. But everyone else has been very, very positive. And I'm thankful for that because I like to hear, and I'm okay with her saying no. I think it's important that we're honest with each other, and to have that view and say, I don't think it's possible is okay. And I appreciate it as a packaging professional.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I should turn this right back on you and ask you that question. Vicki, what do you think? Can packaging be sustainable?
Yes, I think it can. I've learned a lot just in the past several years about how to make packaging sustainable. I've learned a lot about the difference between a linear system and a circular system. And I think it's getting to that circular system of packaging that will get us out of this.
Yeah.
But that requires a lot of participation from a lot of different people and a lot of different industries in order to get out of it. So I think it's a wicked problem, but
Yeah.
I do think it's achievable.
Well said. Great answer, and very true. It's not going to be just you and me. It's
No.
going to be thousands, tens of thousands of people working really hard for a long time to make this change happen.
Yeah, and I think to that end, I think a lot about whose responsibility it is for these different things. And I know I have my opinions on it, but and you can flip that and ask me,
Yep.
whose responsibility do you think it is? Like, how do you think that works?
Very important question, and something we've spent a lot of time discussing on the show. I think we're all involved. We all need to work on it. We all need to take responsibility for our actions, whether that's the consumer saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't buy this material because it's packaged horribly, or the designer like yourself saying, hey, let's look at this a little differently. What if we didn't have 3 layers of packaging? What if we had 2? Or the company that's selling the item, the brand, they need to say, hey, we're going to take a change here and not have these kinds of coatings or foil that can't be recycled as easily. We're going to make it look beautiful, but differently. And so the answer, in my opinion, is all of us need to work together. And that includes the government. The municipalities need to say, okay, we hear you. We're going to make recycling easier. We're going to give you the opportunity to reuse. Things like that. The grocery stores are going to have a huge impact, frankly, in the future. We're going to bring our recycling back to the grocery stores, I think, until curbside can catch up with demand. So lots of people involved with this. How about you? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. You've been doing this a while.
I think there's an ecosystem, and I think it goes back to that community. We can call it community or we can call it ecosystem. I like to use the word ecosystem. And as a designer, I always think about the impact that I can make within that ecosystem to really accelerate the change and the shift to sustainable packaging. And within the ecosystem, I feel like I can affect the shoppers because I'm actually designing with them in mind. I can affect the brands because they're my client. I can then affect the converters because I'm working with the converters to produce and manufacture that packaging. Right. I can affect the suppliers, the OEMs and the suppliers. So these are the people that are the materials or the adhesives or the embellishments. I do a lot on haptics. So the embellishments, I can start to impact that because what's interesting about the position of the designer is they're kind of central to all of that. If I want to say, do some kind of laminate or some kind of finish or some kind of haptic thing on it, I have a direct line into, say, a Novellus, and then they can advise me, but they may not have a direct line into the shoppers and the consumers, because that's a little far past where their value is added.
Right.
And so I feel like through that, I don't know if you want to call that the value chain or what you want to call that, that wheel, I kind of think of it like a wheel. I can affect and impact change and accelerate change through all of those entities, even as far as the MRFs, because I need to understand what is in fact, as you say, curbside recyclable, and what is industrial recyclable, and what is backyard compostable, and what is industrial compostable. And then part of my job, as you say, the grocery stores will be involved. Part of then my job as a designer would be to help a brand educate those shoppers to understand and change that behavior, to take some pieces and put it on curbside, to take some pieces and rip off that film. It's going to landfill because we haven't figured that out yet. Or I'm taking it to another facility, but really to help educate people on what they can do to have their own impact.
So important, so true. We talk a lot in the podcast about life cycle. And we're talking about from the very beginning, how do we harvest the raw materials? Are we using post-consumer recycled material? Are we using virgin materials? Sometimes virgin materials are more sustainable because they're stronger and you can use less. So it's a common misconception that, well, if it's made from recycled material, it must be sustainable. Well, usually, oftentimes, and most of the time, but not always. And so really important to say that. And you've mentioned making small impacts and making small changes.
I want to come back to what you said about the post-consumer waste.
Okay.
I think there's another place where we can educate shoppers, because there's a myth that as much post-consumer waste as possible means it's more sustainable. And you're right, it's not always true. I know in the material and the paper, in the paperboard world, if I'm doing a cosmetic and I need a really white board, it's actually better to use virgin fiber than post-consumer waste, because if I use the post-consumer, I can't get it white enough. Because the post-consumer fiber board is going into one, I can't get the fiber strong enough, like you said, but it's also going into something, might be chipboard, might be newsprint, it's something else. It might be those cores. There's a company that does those cores that go inside of like toilet paper rolls or inside your, that's all recycled material, but that may not necessarily be what my luxury perfume carton is made out of. But then the other thing to recognize too is that those suppliers that are producing virgin fiber, and I'm going to go back to paperboard because it's the most recycled. I try to use as much paperboard as possible in packaging, because I think it's typically around 68 to 70% recycled, whereas plastic might be 8%. So I try to use it as much as possible, but I do know that within that manufacturing process, they are using as much of that material as possible. They have flow loops built in, they're using renewable energy. And again, part of the education is that wood, it's a renewable resource. They are planting forests and planting new plantings as they're taking out, which is also part of the life cycle of the forest. So it's a complicated, it's a complicated issue, but I think that's part of education.
Really well said. And I spent my first 5 years of my career with Weyerhaeuser, and we talked about forestry all the time. I worked at a corrugated mill making boxes, but to get that opportunity to hear about how we sustainably manage forests, how we're planting 10 trees for every single one that we cut, how those are, they're absorbing carbon, and these are great things, right? This is helping the planet. And so it's a very sustainable, very renewable resource. Very important.
Yeah. Okay. Going back to your other question about,
let's talk about that. An example
about some kind of innovation or I think it was an innovation. It was some kind of change, right? Is that what it was?
Something that you did that you felt like had a good impact on the sustainability of a company's packaging.
So recently I told you I did a specialty food company, and they do olive oils and they do bruschettas and they do pasta, and it's all imported. And interestingly, I want to describe the process of what happens and how you go down a path that's less sustainable than you'd like. Okay, so I ended up doing some packaging for them and I did some labels. And I think every designer can relate to, and converters, and you'll know this, is we need it now, but we don't need it now. We want it yesterday, right? They're that anxious for it. But
Yes.
if you want a very sustainable process, you actually need to be able to have the time to test different materials and test different coatings and test different embellishments to see if you can get the shelf impact that you need, and then balance that with sustainability. So in this case, this was a company called Wildfare. I designed the labels. They had to be produced overseas. And they didn't want to take the time, even though I wanted them to take the time. So I put them on, they wanted metallics. So we did some metallics. And now after the fact, I said, okay, but now you actually do, now that you're on the shelf for round 2 in 8 months or 12 months, you actually do need to make these labels more sustainable, because that was part of their brand story in terms of being all organic and good for the environment and good, healthy for people. But healthy for people is also healthy for the earth.
Yes.
And so what we ended up doing is prototyping some different, now we could take the time and we prototyped like 6 or 8 different ideas in order to get a similar shelf impact, not make it so different that people aren't, like, some people may notice the difference, people may not, except that now we can create a label that is 100% recyclable. And I think that can make a big difference. But I also wanted to just point out the practicalities of what's happening just in real time. Not all brands will allow their designer or their converter or the ecosystem to take the time to actually give them the best solution, because they're balancing getting on the shelf, and they're balancing the economics of this, and they're balancing their own business model and sustainability of their own just business, not just sustainable for the environment. So when going back to this idea that it's an ecosystem, I think it goes back to that whole ecosystem and everybody working together on it.
I think that's an incredibly valuable point. And brands are taking calculated risks, and they have to say, okay, are we going to be more sustainable? Are we going to try these changes? And what I'm seeing, even with small brands and big brands, is let's try this product and let's see how that works. And do our consumers appreciate the difference? Do they notice? Oftentimes we'll even get more sales. Millennials are 67% more likely to buy something if it's packaged sustainably. These kinds of things are important for brands to consider. Are you finding that as well when you're working with them?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm seeing the same thing where they will try one product and they'll pilot it, and they'll pilot it in a particular country, or they will pilot it in a particular city to see how it works. Right. And not everything is going to work. I know Johnny Walker launched a paperboard bottle, and I was talking to a friend of mine who drinks that, and I'm not a drinker, so I don't really relate to it. And he's like, yeah, I can't do it. Like, it tastes different. It's just not going to do it. And it's kind of funny, but it also goes back to our perceptions of quality as it relates to the packaging itself, which is why you have to be so balanced in it. It's just that when we're talking about the environment, I think that issue on the list of priority keeps getting elevated. And I think that's really important. And I think that's part of the impact of what you're having in the market as an influencer. And I think it's part of the impact of other designers that are talking about this, because we do have a voice and we can impact the brands that we're working with.
Well, and thank you. And you are having a major impact as well, and highlighting these sometimes failures. We often talk about there's nothing sustainable about going out of business. And that's an important way for us to remember that maybe this risk isn't worth it. Maybe you should do some studies in advance of trying something new. Reach out to some target audience members, your top 5% of your customers, and say, hey, would you like it if we did this? Would you drink this out of a paper bottle? Like we talked about before, I'm going to Paris Packaging Week, and one of the big sections of this event in a few weeks here is spirits packaging. And how do you make spirits packaging more sustainable? Well, there's some really creative things going on, like Colorform doing molded pulp instead of several layers of boxes for these very high-end liquors and champagne brands. It's exciting, but I'm very, very interested on the paper bottle trend and how that plays out.
Yeah, I am too. And you mentioned that pulp. And you've interviewed so many people on your podcast. What are some of the innovations that you've learned about that are just so staggering to you that you can see how it's going to ripple through and make such an impact in sustainable packaging?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are lots. I really enjoyed that one for Colorform, where they're taking molded pulp and making it beautiful and making it like a second skin for the bottle. And so, whereas it used to, there was foam, and then there was an outer, and then there was an inner box, and then there was a shipper box. Well, this eliminates 3 layers. And imagine that impact over hundreds of thousands of bottles. And the consumers love it. They keep the molded pulp. They think it looks beautiful on the bottle. So they're adapting to it. And I was really impressed. And I'm excited to see them in person in a few weeks. But things like that are changing the game. And we're really looking at packaging differently and saying, hey, do we really need 2 boxes here? Could we do one? And that's exciting.
I think one of my favorite ones that I heard was you had someone on who was talking about hotel key cards.
Yeah.
And I think when you ask about a small change that can have an enormous impact, the math, when you put it behind it. So when he was talking, he said 1 key card gets used 3 times. The average hotel has 200 rooms. And then you multiply that by the quantity of hotels that are in just New York, just the United States,
right,
the world, all of a sudden, and you know that we have fiber-based, paperboard-based key cards, right? So they make the substrate so that it's, because we've seen gift cards, right? It's the same material, and I don't know if it's 28 point, and it's manufactured in a way that can be recycled, but just switching over from a plastic key card, from a PVC-based key card to fiber-based, and you look at the math, it's thousands of tons of PVC saving just from one little change.
I agree. That was Michael Dillon from Myers Printing out of Minnesota, and they're a great company. And he's a great guy and a great leader for that company. My friend Adam Peak works there alongside Michael, and it's an incredible innovation. You're absolutely right. I think I cringe a little bit when I get a plastic key card, and I think, I hope they use this 20 times. I hope they reuse it over and over, and I hope eventually it gets recycled. It's possible to recycle those, but it's unlikely. And so very, very important point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier in terms of testing things and knowing how consumers can respond. I think that when we prototype, we can do a lot of that, which, that's part of the whole design thinking movement in terms of concepting, and then you create it, and then you prototype it, and then you change it, and you prototype it, and until you can get it to manufacturing. I do believe that when we are prototyping, we can really start to understand, and consumers can respond. I also think that when you start prototyping, you can get much closer to what consumers and shoppers say they will do and what they actually do, because the data behind what they say in terms of paying more for something that is sustainably packaged, or a sustainable product, as opposed to actually doing that, there's a gap there. And I think if we can prototype more, we can understand that gap better.
Very accurate. And I liken it to political polling, when somebody calls you and says, who are you going to vote for? We've learned in the last election that, or the one before that, that not everyone's always honest with who they say they're going to vote for. And I think that's true with some of these consumers not always saying, oh yeah, of course, I'd spend more for sustainability, but will they really? And are they really on board for this? So very important point to think about. But I've also seen that it can increase sales. It can, it can add value in many of our consumers' minds, like me, and I think you as well, that you will buy it because of it, and you will talk about it because it's exciting. It can increase, brand awareness and loyalty.
Well, and also to some of those points, I'm always curious. And so I'm going to ask you, when we produce sustainable packaging, sometimes it's more expensive. And then you can ask me this back, but sometimes it's more expensive. And so whose job is it to absorb that extra expense? Is it the shopper's job? Is it the manufacturers? Is it the innovators, the suppliers? Is it the brands? Whose job is it to absorb some of these extra costs, or does it always just come back to the shopper?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a touchy question because a lot of us are on strict incomes and a lot of people are struggling with the changes. The answer is it depends. And I know that's the most frustrating. Everybody hates that answer, but oftentimes the government's going to have to step in with some, additional discounts and things like that, grants maybe for businesses that are being more sustainable, but it oftentimes falls on the consumer. I know a lot of brands are really struggling, and I know a lot of suppliers are very tight right now. We've absorbed lots of cost increases over the last several years. The market has been absolutely erratic, and the most cost changes I've ever seen in my 2.5 decades in the business. Absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, nothing to be said of a 30% cost delta from the last time something was ordered. And, that's hard to absorb, but I can assure you the supplier can't absorb it. We'd be cost over sell, assuming their margins are reasonable. But yeah, it often falls on the consumer, which is a challenge, which is why it's on us as designers and suppliers to provide alternatives that aren't always more expensive. How about you? What are your thoughts on that, Vicki?
I think it's complicated also. I mean, I think it's incumbent on the suppliers to really come up with the material innovations because they know those materials so well. So I think it's incumbent on the converters to understand how to use those innovations and make them work within their cost structure. But I think it's incumbent upon the innovator to help that converter work it in, because when you talk about the push and the pull, if you have the innovation, but the converter can't make it work into their cost structure, then they can't offer it to the brand, and the brand can't offer it to the consumer, to the shopper. Or if they can offer it, but then the brand will say yes, but then it changes their margins, and then their business isn't as sustainable, then they can't absorb it. Or if you then offer and let it trickle through to that shopper, and then it gets too expensive and they won't purchase it. So again, I think it goes back to the ecosystem all working together in order to make it work.
Totally agree. 100%. It has to sell through. It has to last as long on the shelf. We can't let the performance of the packaging suffer for sustainability. Very important. But there was one word that you used earlier in this discussion that I really am very interested in learning more about. You mentioned haptics, and I am blown away that you're even thinking about haptics in packaging. Can you explain that to us as consumers and packaging professionals, what that means and how you use that in design?
Absolutely. And I love talking about haptics. I've written articles on haptics. I've done presentations on haptics. I learned the word haptics from one of the suppliers, Sappi makes paperboard, and they make commercial papers, and they make paperboard. And they came out with a piece 10 years ago called The Neuroscience of Touch, which talked all about the importance of haptics in commercial use. But for me, as a packaging designer, I'm looking at haptics in terms of what it does for the feel, because haptics really is one of our senses. So if you think about it as the senses, we have 5 senses, and one of them is the sense of touch, which is what haptics is. And so to me, haptics really enhance the 2 things. It helps us reach out and touch something on a shelf. So if you think about shelf appeal, and there's something very tactile about it, then I'm more likely to reach out and touch it. And then once I touch it, and I'm doing a lot of research on this right now at Clemson University, once I touch it, what's the percentage of time that it goes into my cart? It's high, and that's part of what I'm researching. So I want to look at that in terms of research, because we know that if you touch it, it starts to then trigger psychological ownership just by touching it. And then that can trigger the endowment effect, which means that I think I own it before I even own it. So to me, haptics are key in making packaging appealing to shoppers. And that's just at the shelf. When you start talking about it in an unboxing experience, that haptics and whatever those textures are, whether it's embossed, whether it's a metallic, whether it's some kind of spot UV, on corrugated, it might be something that's die cut differently, or maybe you put a tip on something, on a luxury packaging. So that starts to affect our perception of the product inside, which then goes back to the business goals of that business and might go into, maybe they can charge more for it. Maybe people think it's higher quality. I've done it both directions, where someone wants to charge, where a brand wants to charge more for something, and we add a lot of haptics to make that price justified, or to help them raise the price. Or I've also had the reverse, where brands have come to me and said, hey, here's our design so far. Can you help us with this? Our price point is $79. And I can say to them, if your price point is $79 for that cosmetic, for that cream, that's not a $79 package. Right. We're going to have to add some things to it. So haptics are really amazing in terms of consumer engagement. But now let's bring that back to sustainable packaging.
Right.
Because the most sustainable haptic would be an embossing in terms of what is happening on that label. However, with an embossing, you also have the materials to make that embossing. So you have to have the copper and whatever. And so then that's where I get back into this idea of circularity. So let's just take embossing, for instance. You have that plate, you have that material. Let's say there's copper, it's a metal. Now you've got to get that metal back into the technical circular process, because it's not an organic, right? It's not biological. Let's say I put something metallic on it. Let's say it's a metallic foil stamp. Well, depending on the quantity that's on my label or that's on my folding carton, it may still be recyclable, because there's not enough for it to affect it in the MRFs, and what it is. There's also another piece to that whole idea of haptics, is if I put something into, let's say it's a metal tin, or let's say it's something that's a paperboard carton, or it's a label on a bottle and it's on a glass bottle, and it's so beautiful, I want to keep it. Right. Now it has even more value, because I'm keeping it, and maybe it's a wine bottle and I put wildflowers in it, which means now it's in use longer, which is also part of that whole circularity model. So we want to keep it in use longer, which actually helps. So there's just a lot to this whole idea of haptics. And I didn't even talk about the unboxing experience. When you add haptics, suddenly your unboxing experience goes up, which then helps the brand, which then maybe there's a conversation around sustainable packaging to that. And it can just be really exciting. So clearly, I love talking about haptics.
Thank you. And amazing. I do have a customer called Kai USA Shun Cutlery. They're knives made in Japan, and their boxes have this amazing soft touch feel that we make for them. And that's a big selling factor. People pick them up and they say, ooh, this is really neat. I really like this. This feels cool. It's, it's first they're beautiful, but then second, that tactile feel. So I can definitely concur with what you're saying. Well done.
And that's exactly the response. Anytime I do a haptic embellishment, that's exactly this response we're looking for. Like it just is. That's exactly what I'm looking for, because it made them hold it longer. And when you start to think about this idea of psychological ownership and the endowment effect, then once you're holding it longer, you start to think that it belongs to you longer, and then it's more likely going home with you. But the other thing from what you just described in those few seconds is that, ooh, it must be nice. It suddenly changed the perception of the quality of the product inside. Pretty amazing.
100%. Absolutely important to remember. Some of these items that we're selling in these boxes are hundreds of dollars. And to provide the right package to the consumer that's valuable, that's worth their money, not just the item inside, but the packaging itself needs to inherently have value. Many of these items are gifts, and they need to be able to give them to their friends and family and associates with pride and say, hey, you're worth it. So very true.
Yeah. Well, and then to bring it back to sustainability, when you add that soft touch, then because they're your client, or if they're my client, it's incumbent upon us to then go find that soft touch coating that is environmentally friendly. And that's been hard because these are laminates, and now you're getting into layered materials because you're adding something, or if it's a litholam or the adhesives, this is where this becomes where we need a lot of innovation.
Yes, well said. I interviewed some paper manufacturers recently, and they were talking about the exact same thing. What if we could make it feel like this without coating, with the right chemistry in it, without an additional layer? Like we talk about, some of these high-end boxes have a plastic layer that people don't know about. They're not always totally recyclable, and we need to be honest with each other about that. Excellent. Well, this has been really amazing.
I do have one question that I'm curious about that you may know the answer to. It's possible you've had a guest on. Can you talk about the single stream recycling system that we have in the US, and maybe contrast it or compare it with what's happening in Japan, where they don't, and they almost have a bento box where they're putting their glass and their aluminum and their paperboard and their plastic into different things? Do you feel like the single stream recycling has actually hurt the sustainability of the materials in the United States, or do you feel like it's helped it because it's made it easier for people to recycle?
Oh, wow. Great question. And the answer, I think, is both. It has hurt some areas, but it has helped some areas. I've read stories, so many stories about this. In, I think it was New Jersey or something, they tried to demand that people recycle. Said, you must recycle. And people said, no, we never have before. You can't make us do anything. This is America. You can't demand. Now, in particular, they said, you must take your corrugate and you must tie it up with string, and you must make it easy for you have to make it easier for the consumer. And so where I live in Oregon, it's very easy to recycle. You put it in your blue bin and it gets recycled. And they're expanding that often. We're going to be able to recycle soft plastics like low density polyethylenes and polystyrenes. We will be able to recycle those in the next couple of years, which is very exciting. And they're doing that in Canada as well, successfully. So the answer is, it can be very, very good for the numbers. It can also not impact them at all, because if we're not changing the behavior of the people and encouraging them to, sometimes financially, to recycle. Companies like D6 down in Texas, they have a new program where they'll pay you for every thermoform tray that you bring into Sam's Club. Wow. People want to do that, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of changes over the next several years with extended producer responsibility and different recycling laws that are taking place. Anything else that you wanted to talk about?
No, this has been just an absolute pleasure. And I wanted to thank you very much for having me on, but also allowing me to change your format of it so that I can learn a lot from you. I learn a lot from you every time I listen to your podcast, and I learned more in today's conversation as well.
Well, thank you, Vicki. I appreciate your wisdom and your friendship and partnership in this. This is really fun. I'm excited for the article to come out in Labels and Labeling magazine. Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Yes, and have me back anytime. Thank you.